mean, I'm not sure why we would ever discount like the impact that romantic breakups can have in our life. I think we all know that those are the things that almost all of like our art and media are made about, or like romantic entanglements. This is something that we are so focused on and that we search for and that we crave. And when we have it, we really enjoy them. But then, when it goes wrong, it's like all we can think about. So it's not a surprise that this would be such an emotionally impacting event in people's life, especially if something dramatic happens like a romantic betrayal. And the people who were in the clinical trial described really intense, not just mental and emotional, but physical symptoms coming from these betrayal episodes. Like one person started getting nosebleeds, like they lost weight, they gained weight, their hair was falling out, they started smoking again. Like I said, some person started getting nosebleeds. I mean, this is like a full body reaction to the act of somebody that you thought you were partnered with, like turning around and betraying you. So yeah, I think we should totally take it seriously and not trivialize it just because it's like a breakup or something like that.
What's up, everybody? From Nautilus, I'm Brian Gallagher, and you're watching Behind the Scenes. Today I'm speaking with Shayla Love. Shayla is an award-winning science journalist based in Brooklyn, New York. She writes about psychology, neuroscience, psychedelics, sociology, linguistics, and the intersection of history, culture, and philosophy with present-day research. Her work has been featured in Vice, Stat, Boston Globe, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, Harper's Magazine, and others. A recent story in Nautilus was "This Drug Can Mend a Broken Heart." Shayla, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right. So to start off, would you mind summarizing your intellectual background a bit, as well as your work as a writer? How did you come to focus on science journalism as a career?
Yeah. So I grew up in a family of predominantly scientists. So my parents are X-ray crystallographers, and my aunt and uncle are geologists, and my grandparents are microbiologists. So everybody that I grew up around had a really keen interest in science. So that was sort of, I was born and bred into it. But I always had a deep interest in psychology and kind of the application of science into lived experience. And I also wanted to be a writer. So I ended up merging all of those interests together and becoming a science journalist.
That's super cool. Could you give us a brief summary of your story for our viewers who may not have read it yet?
Yeah. So the origin of this story is that I had heard some work about memory reconsolidation several years back, and that's the idea that memories, when we remember them, they sort of go through this reconsolidation process in which they're fragile for a moment, and people were trying to intervene and alter memories in order to help people with PTSD or traumatic memories that were really interfering with their life. And so this has been something that's been researched for a little while, but I saw this study that was using this approach specifically for people who were dealing with romantic betrayal. So something had happened to them in a relationship. Sometimes it was cheating, sometimes it was just abandonment, people who, were financially ruined after a breakup. And I thought it was such an interesting application of this research topic onto something that we're all so familiar with, which is heartbreak, but in such a targeted way, thinking about how to change those memories that might be bothering us about these romantic entanglements that went wrong. So that's what the piece is about. It's about this attempt to do memory reconsolidation therapy, specifically on people who've gone through romantic betrayal.
What were some of your first thoughts about how to go about reporting and researching the story?
I mean, my first thought was that I really wanted to speak to somebody who was in the trial. I just was very curious what it would be like to have this experience of romantic betrayal and then do this kind of therapy, which isn't just about kind of like processing or getting over it, but really trying to intentionally change and alter the negative emotions that come with a memory. Um, I just was very curious what that was like. So my first step was reaching out to the researchers in the piece and asking if I could be connected to somebody who had participated. And kind of going from there, talking to her and understanding what had happened to her, how she felt about her memories, how she felt like they were plaguing her, and then just hearing a bit about her experience of going through the memory reactivation sessions. The way it works is you take a beta blocker at the same time, and just how she felt it changed her day-to-day life. I think that's really, really captivating for me. And then from there, it opens up a lot of questions about what memory is and how we understand memory. I think memory reconsolidation is not a fully fleshed out process. I think this therapy also is not fully fleshed out. We don't totally know why, when, or even if it works. But I think starting from the person and just hearing what it was like for them, and then sort of zooming out and asking these bigger picture questions about memory was the direction that I wanted to take in reporting it. Because when we're talking about romantic betrayal, of course, that personal experience is the reason the whole trial exists in the first place. So I really wanted to start there with somebody who had gone through that.
So the name of the source you spoke to who's in the trial is Anne Lantoine, I believe, if I
Mm-hmm.
hope I'm pronouncing that right. What was it like talking to her, hearing her story, and hearing how she eventually decided to enter a clinical trial to alter her memory of this traumatic experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that I felt was just a sense of like deep relatability. Like she talked about, this thing happened with her husband where they were supposed to move from Canada, or they were supposed to move from France to Canada together. And then ultimately she found out that he had filed for divorce and he was living with another woman. And she just described being unable to let go of just like the negative feelings that the whole experience had caused for her. So even though she had moved on and they got divorced and it was years later, she just couldn't shake those feelings of like shame and betrayal, that had happened. And I think even though we may not have experienced something that ends up impacting us so as much as it did to Anne on a day-to-day basis, we all kind of know what that's like to remember something that happened to us, that an ex-partner did to us, and to just like have that gross yucky feeling go through your body, and you're like, oh, I just like can't shake that. It's just like something I can't get rid of. So to me, that was really relatable. And then of course for her it was quite extreme. It was interfering with her day-to-day life. There was issues with their realtor and like their real estate agent, who was calling her all the time, and so she was feeling really distressed about like picking up her phone and any like emails coming in. It was something that was really interrupting her, and she was unable to move on. So when she heard about this clinical trial, she signed up right away. And I also think that that's like pretty cool too, to say like, hey, do you want to try this new memory reconsolidation therapy where we're going to try to alter your memories? And she signed up for it. And I think that sort of like curiosity about what it would be like for her was also very interesting to hear that she wanted to go that route.
What was her reaction when you were able to reach out to her and contact her? Was she eager to talk about it? Was she a little hesitant, or yeah?
Yeah, she was totally down to talk about it, and I think she got a lot out of the clinical trial, which is one of the reasons that she is really willing to talk about it. She described to me, it's not that she forgot what happened to her; it's all still there in her mind, but it's just the emotional reactivity has gone down a lot, and so for her, it kind of gave her her day to day functioning back, and so she feels really positively about the therapy. So she wanted to talk about it. But this is, it's something that I keep in mind as a reporter a lot, which is that often the people who are most interested and willing to share are the ones that it either worked really, really well for, or it worked really, really badly for, like it didn't work at all. And so you sort of lose a bit of the nuance in the middle. And so she's a really good example, um, to include in the piece, because it sounds great, like it worked for her, and don't want to detract from that experience for her. But as the piece gets into, memory reconsolidation therapy is a bit complicated, and it might not work super well for everybody, and we're not totally sure why. So for Anne, she was really ready and willing to talk about it, but we shouldn't extrapolate her experience to every single person who might be thinking about wanting to try therapy like this.
Hmm. So, what do we know about why it is that sometimes memories like that won't let us go? I mean, isn't it the normal course of events where if something really bad happens to us, it affects us for a long time, but we kind of learn from it, we grow from it, and it's holding us kind of loosens over time. But that's not what happened for her. So, do we know anything about why it is that sometimes these memories will, kind of maintain their sting for long after they should have um, been more, I don't know, not harmless, but something that's more easy to cope with?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a big question that we don't totally have the answer to, which is that why is it that sometimes bad things happen to us and we sort of have resiliency, and then sometimes things like PTSD happen, or in this trial, it wasn't technically PTSD because the official definition of that is it has to be like a life-threatening event, and a breakup, even though it feels like one, is usually not a life-threatening event. So they called this adjustment disorder, which is basically when you can't get over the thing, like you just can't get over it for some reason. And I don't think we have a great answer to that. If we could predict who and when and what the circumstances were to turn something into a post-traumatic growth moment where like people really bounce back and are resilient after something, that would be great if we could understand those parameters. But we don't really understand why it is that sometimes these things that happen slip into PTSD. I think simultaneously sometimes really bad things happen to people and they go through a sort of typical reactive period, and then they're okay afterwards. It's like they processed it and they moved on. And I just think there's so many factors. It's really hard to say why and when one happens over the other.
Um, this is interesting to consider. I'm curious to know what you think about this. So, the idea that it wasn't classified as PTSD because it's not life threatening, but perhaps this is, if you take an evolutionary psychological angle from it, being abandoned in a relationship kind of in our evolutionary history would have been life threatening, would it not? I mean, if you had someone supporting you and providing resources, and then that person just disappears and doesn't want to help anymore, that it seems like that would be a very kind of significant threat to your survival. So I wonder if that is, um, I guess in a modern context, it's not no longer life threatening, but perhaps in the normal kind of situation over our evolutionary history, that would have been closer to the case. What do you think?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, this is sort of the reason that if you want to take that sort of like evo psych approach, like why we have attachments at all, because we're social animals and it behooves us to like live in groups and like help each other and share resources and things like that. So if you get left alone, yeah, it's really damaging on many reasons. I think one of the interesting sort of like side bodies of work in relation to this paper is that one of the first authors on the paper, Michelle, she wrote a bunch of papers arguing why romantic betrayal was attachment disorder and maybe possibly crossed over into more like PTSD territory at all. And she did a lot of qualitative interviews with people where she asked them to describe what it's like to go through romantic betrayal, and she compared them to experiences that people have with other kinds of trauma or other kinds of adjustment disorder, and just like really highlighting how intense and overwhelming and disrupting these experiences can be. I mean, I'm not sure why we would ever discount like the impact that romantic breakups can have in our life. I think we all know that those are the things that almost all of like our art and media are made about, or like romantic entanglements. This is something that we are so focused on and that we search for and that we crave. And when we have it, we really enjoy them. But then, when it goes wrong, it's like all we can think about. So it's not a surprise that this would be such an emotionally impacting event in people's life, especially if something dramatic happens like a romantic betrayal. And the people who were in the clinical trial described really intense, not just mental and emotional, but physical symptoms coming from these betrayal episodes. Like one person started getting nosebleeds, like they lost weight, they gained weight, their hair was falling out, they started smoking again. Like I said, some person started getting nosebleeds. I mean, this is like a full body reaction to the act of somebody that you thought you were partnered with, like turning around and betraying you. So yeah, I think we should totally take it seriously and not trivialize it just because it's like a breakup or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, the calling it or trying to understand it under the rubric of like an adjustment disorder seems to kind of make a little light of it. I don't know. But yeah, like when you have a really deep relationship with someone, then all of a sudden that ends and you're left totally puzzled as to why or how that happened. It can feel like, I don't know, like part of your psychology was like surgically removed without you knowing. It's like, yeah, it's so awful. Um, Can you tell us any more interesting tidbits or anecdotes or ideas that you had for the piece that, for whatever reason, you ended up not mentioning or cutting, or just things that you had come across in research that you thought were particularly intriguing?
Yeah, I mean, this ended up in the piece a little bit, but I didn't expand on it that much because it was a little tangential and maybe more a little more philosophical, which is, when memory reconsolidation therapy first started to be published about, there were some people raising ethical questions of like, is it okay to go in and like erase people's memories? They're not really erasing memories, but that was the rebuttal. Is like, we're not erasing the memory, we're erasing the emotional content of the memory, or we're like turning the knob down on the emotional side of it so that everybody can still remember the facts of what happened. They just don't feel as reactive or as negatively about what happened. And so then that seemed to like appease people, that like, oh, as long as the facts of the memory are still there, then like the memory is still intact. It's just that the emotions are gone. I think that's a very interesting distinction to make. That if as long as the facts of the memory are there, then it's still intact. To me, the emotions are like a really big part of the memory. I would argue that when you remove the emotional component, the facts aren't really enough. Like if you're talking about it's okay to leave the memory unchanged, I would argue that it is really changed, and that's kind of the point, right? I'm not against this kind of therapy at all. Like I think it can be really helpful to people. Other kinds of therapy also seek to like reframe and reappraise our memories in similar ways. But I thought that bias towards like the facts are what comprise the memory. The emotions are just like this thing you can leave or take, and like the memory is fine whether or not that's there. I thought that was a really interesting undercurrent in the ethical discussions about this therapy.
Yeah, I mean, it must have been really interesting to talk to Anne about what her experience is now as she recalls the memory that used to bring her so much pain, and now it just seems much more attenuated. And yeah, I can't really imagine what that must be like. But did
I, you
did
know,
you feel like she was able to make it seem intuitive?
Yeah, I mean, she had a really lovely metaphor where she described it as looking at a scar that had healed, right? So you can see the mark on your body, and you remember that you were injured there, but it doesn't hurt anymore. But you can still see it. And so I thought that was, and I think to a certain extent, we all sort of know what it's like because memory reconsolidation is something that we all do all the time. This is a natural brain process that these researchers are basically just trying to take advantage of, but that memories do all the time. This is just our way. It's thought of just our memories being able to update with new information. They become pliable, and then when they get reconsolidated, there's new information added or taken away into them. So I think we all can intuitively understand just because we actually have all been through this process before, and it might just be called like healing, like something gets emotionally diminished over time, and maybe that's because we've been working on it, or maybe we're exposed to different ideas about experiences that we had. So it sounds like, it both sounds really sci-fi. It sounds very like Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, to go in and tinker with the memories and be like, you're not sad about this anymore. But I also think that it might be a more like subtle process that we could all sort of like kind of get what it's like based on our just like living through things and remembering them and getting over them and reprocessing them.
Yeah. Do you think there is some sci-fi maybe dystopian scenario where it just becomes a norm, where if people are faced with something that's hard to deal with, a difficult memory, that just, oh, I'll just take this treatment and I'll be able to nullify the pain of that. Do you think there's something, um, I don't know if unethical is the right word, but it might hinder the personal growth and sort of um, your own path of maturation as a person, to be able to rely on that kind of a treatment if it were more normalized in the culture.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I did ask like some of the researchers if they thought that all psychotherapy in the future you would just like pop a beta blocker before you go into your session. And they seem to think that that's not really it probably just wouldn't really work very well because again, we're trying to take advantage of this really specific window of time when a memory is recalled, but there's all these details and caveats that we don't understand yet. Like it maybe the memory only has a specific time frame that it can be reconsolidated, or if you remember something that's too different, just a new memory is formed rather than updating the old memory, and then there's two memories competing. I don't think that we know how it works well enough for it to be targeted in that way. I think in terms of like whether it would inhibit growth, there is kind of a bias to do things in psychology sort of like white knuckle through it, and it only matters if you do the healing on your own, right? I think people sometimes feel this about antidepressants, like I should be able to feel better by myself. And we have this conversation a lot now around psychedelic assisted therapy. What does it mean to have a psychotherapy assisted by a drug? Is it the drug or is it the therapy that's being pushed along by the drug? Does it change the value or like how much attention we should pay to the therapy itself just because there's now a drug involved? I think these are sort of questions that we're going to have to tease out as more of these therapeutic modalities come forward. But I think in cases like Anne's, when you are unable to like live your day-to-day life, basically, how can you do any healing if you just like, you're so stressed you can't even look at your phone? There's an interesting similarity that people take beta blockers sometimes for public speaking. I don't know if you've known anybody who does this. Like people who get really anxious with public speaking will take a beta blocker before they get on stage, and it sort of, it calms your blood pressure down, and it helps them get over their nerves and actually like do the thing that they need to do. And I thought about that as I was working on this piece because people are already using this drug, not in a similar way, but I was like, would you argue that they should do their speech without it? Or if that's the only way that they can get their speech done, maybe that's just like the way they need to get it done. And I'm not like advising off-label beta blocker use. Speak to your doctor about that. But, I think doing the thing and like going through the process of healing, no matter how it works for you, is probably the most functional way for us to think about any person getting over trauma.
Yeah. The only person, the person that comes to mind when you mentioned that was Bo Burnham, the musician
Mm.
comedian who he said he would always have panic attacks like when he's on stage performing. I can't imagine that, like just having um, your profession be entertainment and performance and get super nervous about performing. That seems really difficult. I don't know what he did to try to deal with that, but yeah, it sounds super hard.
Yeah, and
Um,
the other forms of like therapy that we have for PTSD or like phobias, they can be really, really tough. Like exposure therapy is really hard. I have OCD. I did years of exposure therapy, and it's very
mm,
effective and it's incredibly difficult. I would have to basically clear the rest of my day after sessions because they're so upsetting. Because and you
mm.
just again, you have to sort of like white knuckle your way through confronting these things that you're so afraid of. Yeah, maybe if I had had the option to take a beta blocker and make it just like a little better, sure, maybe I would have done. If the end result was the same, like yeah, why not?
Mhm. Well, you want to share a little bit about what you're working on right now? Any more stories you got in the works?
Yeah, I'm working on several things right now. One of them is about dizziness. the feeling of dizziness and the sensation of dizziness, and why it's so hard kind of both to describe but also pin down when people go into the doctor's office for dizziness, and also about the history of dizziness, because this is a sensation that's been with us for many thousands of years. I always like to like go into the past and hear how people described both like medical and mental symptoms using the cultural language and like metaphors of their time and compare them to the present. And I think the differences there and the similarities are really fascinating. So yeah, dizziness is a sensation and a topic that I've been very interested in lately and that I'm writing about.
That's really cool. Yeah, I don't know how I would describe the feeling of being dizzy. It's like you're it's like something swirling around in your consciousness. But I mean, that's just because you're spinning usually, and it makes you dizzy. But sometimes you could feel dizzy, obviously, when you're not spinning, and that's when you have to go to the doctor.
Right.
But yeah, that's interesting. Um, all right. Do you want to tell our viewers where they can find you online to find your work as it comes out? Are you on social media? You have a website people
Yes,
can visit?
I am on Twitter for now, at least. My username is at Shayla Love with 2 underscores between them, and then my website is shayla-love.com.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Shayla. It was great talking to you.
Thanks for having me.